Welcome to Life Stories, where real moments turn into powerful lessons. Today's story is about Michael Carter, a man who thought he was just heading home until flashing lights in his rearview mirror changed everything. Wrongfully arrested by officers who had no idea who he really was. Michael's experience exposes the deep flaws in a system meant to protect. But justice has a way of revealing itself. And this night would become a turning point for an entire city. Stay with us as we unfold this gripping tale of truth, accountability, and change. Subscribe now to start today's story with Life Stories. The night air was still. The kind of silence that makes the world feel smaller. As if wrapped in a gentle cocoon. I had just left a meeting with community leaders in downtown Atlanta. A long but fulfilling discussion about the changes I hoped to bring to the police force. My mind was drifting toward home, where my wife, Lauren, was probably setting the table. Her famous pot roast waiting for me. I smiled at the thought, inhaling deeply as I turned onto Sycamore Avenue. My car, a simple black sedan, blended into the quiet suburban streets. I glanced at the speedometer, 29 miles per hour in a 35 zone. Everything was in order. No broken taillights. No reckless maneuvers. Just a tired man heading home. And then, in an instant, the night was sliced apart by the flashing red and blue lights in my rearview mirror. A chill ran down my spine. A reaction not from fear, but from experience. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and pulled over. My heart beating a little faster than before. I had been in situations like this before, not as a suspect, but as a man who understood how fragile these moments could be. I whispered to myself, "Stay calm. Follow the steps. Hands visible. Movement slow. Voice even." The patrol car's siren died down as two officers approached. The first, a tall man with a flashlight in hand, moved briskly toward my window. The second, stockier, lingered near the rear bumper, his hand resting too comfortably on his holstered weapon. The flashlight beam cut through the dimly lit interior of my car, lingering on my face a fraction too long before sweeping over my lap and the console. "You in a hurry tonight?" the first officer barked. His voice carried suspicion, not curiosity. "No, sir," I answered evenly. "Just heading home." The flashlight jerked back up to my face. "License and registration." I nodded and moved slowly. "I'm reaching for my registration now," I narrated, keeping my voice steady. "My license is in my wallet. I'll get it after this." The officer didn't respond, but his posture stiffened. A few seconds later, as I handed over my documents, he asked, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Before I could answer, he continued, "You were driving erratically, swerving into the other lane." A frown creased my forehead. "With all due respect, sir, I wasn't swerving. My dash cam can verify that." His expression hardened. "Dash cam? Heh. That'll be confiscated for evidence. Step out of the vehicle." I blinked, surprised by how quickly the situation escalated. "Is there a problem?" "Officer, I'm complying fully." His jaw clenched. I said, "Step out of the vehicle. Now." A lump formed in my throat. Not from fear, but from the crushing weight of reality. I had done nothing wrong. Yet here I was, being treated as a suspect. I unbuckled my seatbelt and opened the door, raising my hands in clear view. Before I could fully stand, the second officer grabbed my arm and yanked me toward the patrol car. "Is this necessary?" I asked, keeping my voice measured. Resisting. "Ha," the first officer sneered. "You wanna play that game? Fine by me." The cold bite of metal wrapped around my wrists as the handcuffs snapped shut. The irony was suffocating. I had spent my entire career fighting for justice. And now I was being subjected to the very abuse of power I had worked to eliminate. As they shoved me into the back of the squad car, I caught a glimpse of the neighborhood. Silhouettes moved behind the blinds of nearby houses. Porch lights glowed, casting long shadows. They were watching. But no one stepped outside. The patrol car pulled away. The quiet street swallowed by the hum of the engine. I sat stiffly, staring out the window as familiar landmarks blurred past. Up front, the two officers exchanged casual banter, as if this was just another routine stop. "So, what's your story?" the younger officer, Miller, according to his name tag, asked through the rearview mirror. "Late-night drug run? Or you just like giving us a hard time?" I met his gaze without flinching. "I'm just a man trying to get home." "Yeah. Sure," the older officer, Johnson, snorted. "Reckless drivers always have an excuse." I bit my tongue. Arguing wouldn't help. I took a deep breath, running through my options. I knew my rights. I also knew that, in this moment, they wouldn't matter. When we arrived at the precinct, the harsh fluorescent lights of the holding area cast sharp shadows against the walls. Miller removed my cuffs with a mocking flourish. "Welcome to our humble abode," he said. "You're gonna be here for a while." "Am I being charged?" I asked, rubbing my wrists. "We'll let you know once we figure that out," Johnson replied with a smirk. "Sit tight." I was led into a small, cold cell. The door clanged shut behind me, the sound reverberating in the still air. I sat down on the metal bench, my mind racing. I had spent years building a career rooted in justice and fairness, only to be reduced to another nameless black man in a holding cell. Outside, I could hear Miller and Johnson laughing quietly. Nothing unusual on his record. Miller muttered, "Doesn't matter." Johnson replied, "Guys like him always have skeletons in the closet." I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. I wasn't angry. I was calculating. They had no idea who I was, but they were about to find out. The hours dragged by, each minute stretching longer than the last. The holding cell was small, the air thick with the stale scent of disinfectant and cold steel. I leaned back against the wall, my hands clasped together, my mind not on my own situation, but on the weight of what had just happened. I had seen injustice before, witnessed it firsthand in my years on the force, fought against it in my policies and training sessions. But experiencing it personally was something else entirely. It wasn't the handcuffs that bothered me. It wasn't even the humiliation of being thrown into a cell. It was the realization that, despite my position, despite my service, I was still just another faceless suspect in their eyes. Footsteps echoed down the hall. Someone was coming. I sat up straighter as a woman in uniform stopped outside my cell. Her badge read Lieutenant Harper. Unlike the two officers who had arrested me, she carried herself with quiet authority. There was no arrogance, no unnecessary bravado, just the sharp, assessing gaze of someone who knew something wasn't right. She flipped through a folder in her hands before looking up at me. "Mr. Carter, do you have any idea why you were stopped tonight?" I met her gaze. "I was told it was for reckless driving, which I categorically deny. My dash cam can verify that." Her expression hardened as she turned toward the two officers standing near the desk. Johnson and Miller. They had been watching, smug and relaxed. But now, their postures stiffened. "You didn't review his dash cam footage?" she asked. Her tone clipped. Miller shrugged. "Didn't get to it yet." Harper exhaled sharply, clearly displeased. "Get it now." Her voice carried weight, the kind that demanded immediate action. "And Daniels. Read my office. Now." The two officers exchanged uneasy glances before shuffling toward the back offices. I remained still, watching. The tide was beginning to turn. Minutes later, Harper returned, this time holding a tablet in her hand. She tapped the screen, frowning as she scrolled through the footage. Her expression grew darker with each passing second. Finally, she glanced up at me. "We reviewed your dash cam," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "It directly contradicts the officer's report." I nodded but remained silent. I had already known that. What I wanted to know was, what would she do about it? Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You'll be released immediately," she continued. "But I'd like to discuss next steps privately." Next steps. I knew what that meant. This wasn't just going to be an apology and a handshake. There were consequences coming. A few moments later, I was out of the cell, following Harper down the hallway toward her office. The precinct was quiet, the energy subdued. As we walked past the front desk, I noticed that some of the officers were looking at me now with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Word was spreading. Inside her office, Harper closed the door and gestured for me to sit. The space was simple. No unnecessary decorations. No distractions, just a desk, a filing cabinet, and a worn leather chair. She sat across from me, folding her hands together. "Before we go any further," she said, "I need to ask, who are you really?" I smiled slightly, leaning back in my chair. "I appreciate your diligence, Lieutenant. But let's just say I've been in situations like this before. I've learned to stay calm." She studied me for a moment before nodding. "Fair enough. But I have a feeling this isn't the last we'll hear of this situation." She was right. This was just the beginning. The early morning sun was just beginning to rise as I walked out of the precinct, the cool air cutting against my skin. The night had been long, but I wasn't heading home just yet. I had work to do. Instead of turning toward my house, I drove straight to the police headquarters, pulling into my reserved parking spot with a sense of purpose. I knew what needed to happen next. This wasn't just about me, this was about something bigger. Inside, the station was already stirring to life. Officers beginning their shifts. Coffee brewing in the break room. As I stepped through the front doors, my assistant, Anita, looked up from her desk, her eyes widening in surprise. "Chief Carter," she said, standing quickly. "You're here early." I gave her a small nod, my expression unreadable. "It's been a long night. Anita, I need you to prepare a briefing room for me. I'll be addressing the department this afternoon." She hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Understood." I walked into my office and closed the door behind me, exhaling deeply. I could already feel the weight of what was coming, but I welcomed it. If last night had proven anything, it was that the system I was now responsible for was broken in ways I could no longer ignore. But first, there was one more storm to weather: the courtroom. The courthouse was packed. Word had spread quickly about my case, and the local media had latched onto the story. Outside, cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and bystanders murmured among themselves. Inside, the tension was thick, the energy in the room almost electric. I sat at the defendant's table, my lawyer, Rachel Torres, flipping through a thick folder of evidence. Rachel was sharp, unrelenting, and had a reputation for dismantling weak arguments with surgical precision. Across from us, Officers Johnson and Miller sat stiffly, their department-appointed attorney whispering furiously in their ears. Johnson looked nervous. His foot tapped against the floor, his hands clasped tightly together. Miller, on the other hand, was still trying to look unfazed, leaning back in his chair with a smug expression. The judge, an older man with a no-nonsense demeanor, entered the room and called the session to order. His gaze was stern as he addressed the prosecution. "We are here today to address the charges brought against Mr. Michael Carter," he said. "Prosecution. You may proceed." A young, hesitant prosecutor stood up. He cleared his throat before speaking. "Your Honor, on the night in question, the defendant was observed driving recklessly, swerving into another lane. Upon being stopped by Officers Johnson and Miller, he became uncooperative and resisted arrest." Rachel barely suppressed a smile. She leaned toward me and whispered, "They're walking right into it." When it was her turn, Rachel stood with absolute confidence. Her voice was steady, commanding. "Your Honor, the charges against my client are not only baseless, but are also a direct result of racial profiling and abuse of power. To prove this, I'd like to present video evidence that directly contradicts the officer's statements. The judge nodded. Proceed. Rachel gestured toward the bailiff, who dimmed the lights and started the video. The courtroom fell silent as the footage played. On screen, my car moved steadily within the lane, my speed constant at 29 miles per hour. The patrol car behind me flashed its lights without cause. Then came the body cam footage. The courtroom watched as the officers approached my vehicle, their tone aggressive from the start. The audio was damning, Miller muttering under his breath. Another one of them causing trouble, followed by Johnson chuckling and replying, "Figures." A ripple of gasps spread through the audience. The judge's brow furrowed deeply as he turned to the officers. Rachel paused the video. This is the professionalism displayed by officers Johnson and Miller. She turned back to the jury. Now, let's fast forward to the arrest. The footage continued, showing me complying calmly, narrating my movements as I retrieved my registration and license. The contrast between my measured demeanor and the officer's hostility was undeniable. By the time the video ended, the courtroom was tense, the silence thick. Rachel turned to the jury. "This isn't just an abuse of power," she said. "This is a direct violation of my client's rights, rooted in bias and prejudice." The prosecutor stood, visibly flustered. The officers believed they had probable cause. Rachel cut in sharply. Probable cause based on what? Driving safely? Following instructions? Or perhaps, was it the color of his skin? The judge banged his gavel lightly. "Let's keep this focused." Rachel softened her voice, but her words remained powerful. "Your Honor, before we proceed further, my client has something to share with the court." I stood, adjusting my tie. The room was watching me now, waiting. I scanned the faces in front of me, pausing briefly on Johnson and Miller. Their confidence was gone. "My name is Michael Carter," I said, my voice firm. "I am the chief of police for this city. I was appointed 3 weeks ago to lead this department and address the very issues you've seen here today." A murmur spread through the room. I could see reporters scribbling furiously, cameras clicking. I chose not to disclose my position early. I continued, because I wanted the truth to come out organically without bias or interference. And now, it has. Johnson's face turned pale. Miller's smugness evaporated in an instant. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. But the truth had already hit like a thunderclap. This wasn't just a revelation. This was a reckoning. The courtroom's tension lingered long after the judge dismissed the case. Outside, cameras flashed. Reporters clamored for a statement. And the city buzzed with the revelation. But for me, this wasn't just about proving my innocence, it was about something bigger. Johnson and Miller were swiftly suspended, and an internal investigation into police misconduct followed. Public pressure grew, sparking conversations about racial bias and the urgent need for reform. As chief of police, I took that responsibility to heart. I implemented new policies, reinforced accountability, and stood firm in my commitment to justice. Change didn't happen overnight, but step by step, we rebuilt trust. At a community meeting weeks later, a young man stood up and said, "What happened to you could have been me. Thank you for fighting for us." I nodded, my heart full of resolve. Because this fight wasn't just mine, it was for all of us. Subscribe to Life Stories for more powerful true stories.